Mrs. Edmonds lived at Figtree Cottage in the grounds of a country house. Her son Harry Edmonds ran a coffee importing company. His family lived in the main house of Kingfisher Lodge in Brambridge in East Leigh, while Georgina, Mrs. Edmonds, had moved into the cottage in the grounds a short time ago so that she would be close to her son and he could keep an eye on her. She was 77 years of age and now becoming quite frail. She was still managing well on her own. She was a mother, a grandmother, and was often visited by her family. They were all so close. Georgina was a fairly lively character. She led an active life and she always had a couple of dogs in the house with her. And she was fastidious about making sure they had a good walk every morning and every afternoon. Georgina did suffer from osteoporosis and had several hip replacements, but she never complained. She was always a positive person, always happy. On a morning, one of the ground workers would arrive to walk the dogs for her, and Georgina would always be ready for them when they arrived. The man would check in on her, make sure she was okay, and walk the dogs. That morning he arrived as usual. Georgina seemed happy, and she was pleasantly talking to him. He walked the dogs and brought them back, and everything seemed to be okay at Figtree Cottage that morning. Also that morning, Georgina had the hairdresser round. She'd been doing Georgina's hair for over 17 years.
I said you look 10 years younger.
You're flattering me. You know I'm not. Oh, right, yes, that's lovely. Oh, thank you. You always do it so well.
After I said goodbye, packed my stuff in the car, drove out of the gate, closed the gate, and off I went to my next lady.
Later that afternoon, as her son Harry looked onto the cottage, he noticed that all the lights were out. He said it was odd and decided to check on his mother. So Harry rang the groundsman and asked them if they'd seen her that day and if she'd been okay. They said that they'd walked the dog and everything seemed fine, and they said that they would pop by now with him to check on her. So as the groundsman approached the house, Harry was already there, and he had to climb through one of the bedroom windows that he managed to open in order to get into the property. He walked through the house while it was dark, calling out for his mother, but she didn't respond. And Harry found his mother laid on the floor of the cottage. She was covered in blood and bludgeoned to death with a marble rolling pin. Georgina was laying face down in a pool of her own blood, with the broken rolling pin left near her body. Police were called and quickly cordoned off the area, taking statements from her son and anyone who had spoken to Georgina that day. They wanted to build up a picture of her movements. Officers went door to door asking people if they'd seen anything suspicious. Had anyone been hanging around? Police believed that Georgina did not lock her doors during the day. Forensics photographed the scene, collecting evidence to hopefully work out who could have been responsible for this horrific crime. And Georgina's son Harry contacted his other siblings to let them know, and they were absolutely devastated. The only thing that seemed to have been taken from the property was Georgina's handbag, a rattly black bag with a little dog on the front, and her purse inside.
The killer locked the door and took the key with them.
How could anyone do this to a frail old lady who did nothing to harm anyone? Someone who lived quietly in her cottage? A post-mortem examination later found that Georgina had died from extensive head injuries and blood loss, as well as 37 stab wounds. Detectives initially had no idea who could have been responsible for the murder.
Earlier that day, a man was seen here, bridge, yards from Georgina's cottage. Need to know about a man seen very close to Georgina's home. Couldn't find anything buried here, so what on earth was he doing? And more importantly, who is he?
But then something odd happened. Not long after Mrs. Edmonds' body had been found, a man believed to be using her credit card was seen at an ATM machine trying to draw funds out from her bank account. A man wearing a high-vis jacket covering his face, making it very difficult for police to work out who it was. But they did know now that this was probably the reason why she'd been murdered in the first place.
Okay, so tell me about the phone. We mentioned it there in the reconstruction. It is significant. Tell us why.
Yeah, it's extremely significant. That was found 10 days later on the towpath. We can now confirm that the phone was actually turned on at 13 minutes past 3 that afternoon, which would tend to suggest the murders obviously happened just before then. Mrs. Edmonds' handbag was taken. That was a Radley handbag. In that was her purse. There was a silver credit card holder, which is quite unusual, and also a debit card that was taken that was used later on.
Are you confident that the killer had local knowledge?
We are. The clues tend to suggest that the person came on foot and left on foot, and obviously we had the usage of the card that was about 2 miles away from Mrs. Edmonds' cottage evening. That tends to suggest it's somebody local.
Remind us, the two people you are very, very keen to trace.
Really keen on the ATM guy that was seen at 10:38 that evening using her card, and also the guy who's also matching a similar description with a fluorescent jacket seen at 1 o'clock that afternoon. Also the guy that was seen crouching in the woods. That was about 3 o'clock, close to the time when the phone was activated.
There is a substantial reward here.
There's £25,000 now that's put into this. There's Hampshire Police and the family have put up that reward.
But then detectives discovered something strange. It was a mobile phone that was discovered on a towpath near the cottage. It was 2 weeks after her death, and police now believed that a man had entered Georgina's house that day to get money, torturing her for her PIN number and bank card before bludgeoning her to death using a rolling pin. So who did the phone belong to? Well, it belonged to a man named Matthew at Hamlin's. He was 37 and lived in Cambourne Close in Bishopstoke. He was an electrician by trade, married and a father of one. Of course, police immediately focused their attention onto him. Why was his phone found in the grounds? He had not done any work for the family. He had no reason to be on that private property. And as they interviewed Matthew, they felt he was very cold. He didn't show any emotion towards the family or Georgina's death, telling police he did not even know who she was. But police found that Mr. Hamlin had been in the area at the time of the murder, and subsequently Matthew was arrested and charged with the murder of Georgina Edmonds. Now, it's not fully known exactly what the police had on Matthew Hamlin, apart from the fact that he was seen in the area around the time that his phone was found in the grounds, and that police felt that it was him on CCTV trying to draw cash from her account, whether they'd found fingerprints or any DNA, and this was not thoroughly documented in the news. At the trial in 2012, Matthew Hamlin was accused of killing 77-year-old Georgina Edmonds, but the jury ultimately found him not guilty. Her family were mortified that they did not get the justice for their mother that she deserved. Police were frustrated that all of their hard work had turned to nothing, and police felt that Matthew was the man responsible. But even if they found more evidence on him, due to the double jeopardy law that existed in the UK at the time, Matthew Hamlin could not be tried twice for the same crime. But this law was about to change, making it suddenly possible for suspects to be tried twice. So detectives got forensics involved to try and find as much as they could on Matthew. When the new DNA evidence emerged linking him to the scene of the crime, it ultimately led to him being rearrested for murder. The man who thought he had got away with it was now being rearrested. Matthew was pissed. Prosecutors claimed that Matthew Hamlin was a man that was seen on CCTV in a high-vis jacket attempting to take cash from an ATM in Twyford Road hours after Mrs. Edmonds' body was found, and he was tried again. His retrial came following the relaxation of the double jeopardy rule. After he was acquitted the first time, the blouse that Mrs. Edmonds had been wearing when she was murdered was retested for DNA traces at a laboratory in Chorley in 2014, and a match was found to Matthew Hamlin. His phone had also been found near her cottage, and it was private land, and cameras showed he was in the area at the time. They also believed that it was him on CCTV trying to take money out of her account. The results showed that the DNA material found on her blouse was 26 million times more likely to belong to Matthew Hamlin than to anyone else. And during the second trial, Mr. Justice Spencer ruled that jurors should be told about the history of the case as not telling them could lead to speculation as to the reason for the long delay in the blouse being tested. The QC for Mr. Hamlin argued that telling the jury about this irrelevant matter was grossly unfair and made the conviction unsafe. He said that letting the panel know there had been a previous trial and the date of it shone a spotlight on the new DNA evidence. The barrister added it also raised the possibility of the jury considering that the applicant had got away with murder at the first trial and therefore strengthened the resolve to convict. But dismissing this case, Lord Justice Fulford said both the fact this was a second trial and the date of the original trial were relevant, and the judge was entitled to rule the jury should know. During the 3-month trial at Winchester Crown Court, the prosecution claimed that Mr. Hamlin from Bishopstoke went to the house and tortured Mrs. Edmonds that day for her bank details and PIN code, before killing her with a marble rolling pin. He was then seen in the area after Mrs. Edmonds' death. Grandmother Georgina Edmonds was brutally murdered back in 2008 inside her cottage in Bamborough in Eastleigh. Her son Harry Edmonds, who ran a coffee importing company, described how he had a feeling of foreboding as he arrived at his mother's cottage that day. He explained that his family lived in the main house of the Kingfisher Lodge, while his mother had moved into the adjacent cottage a few years previously. He told the jury at Winchester Crown Court that as he arrived that day at her home after work on Friday, January the 11th, the home was in complete darkness. He said, "I was struck by the fact that it looked so dark. It seemed to be a foreboding atmosphere and I was so conscious of it," he said. He explained that he had intended to see his 77-year-old mother to show some photographs of his son who had been acting in a play and won an award. When he went to the cottage, he believed that she was asleep, so he rang the phone as not to give her a fright. But he said that when he did, she did not respond. He became concerned and decided to climb through her bedroom window, a window that he had managed to open. At the same time, 2 groundsmen, Ian Wrightson and Bob Whale, who he had contacted by phone, had arrived. Mr. Edmonds said, "I heard voices coming from the main door and I looked across and it was Ian coming in, but there was no Granny. I saw some legs on the floor. I thought, oh my God, this is terrible. She's had an accident. I put the light on and there was Granny, laying on the ground, flat on her face, and there was a huge pool of blood coming out from under her head. And unfortunately, because it was dark, I had trodden in this. I realised I had been treading those bloody footprints through the carpet." Mr. Edmonds said that he called 999 and told the operator, "I think there's been a murder here." He told the court that she was clearly dead. She wasn't moving and there was a huge pool of blood. "I didn't want to touch her because I know you do not touch a crime scene, and there was a big dent in her head and she'd clearly received a blow or blows of sorts." He said that after a wait, an ambulance crew arrived and confirmed the death, with police arriving a while later. The trial was heard that Mrs. Edmonds was stabbed several times with a knife by her killer, who tortured her to force her to reveal her bank card and PIN number. She was also hit over the head with a marble rolling pin from the kitchen where her body was found. Mr. Hamlin from Bishopstoke, near Eastleigh, denied murder. Matthew Hamlin was on trial for the second time over the murder of Mrs. Edmonds, who was 77. One of the defence's witnesses testified to Matthew's honesty and sense of humour at Winchester Crown Court. A former colleague, Tom Moore, said, "He's a great guy. He's a good friend of mine. He's loyal, honest and fun. He's a hard worker and very committed." The court also heard that 4 witnesses failed to point Hamlin out at an identity parade after Mrs. Edmonds' body had been found in 2008. Mr. Hamlin watched from the dock as the defence read out testimonies from 20 people who were in Banbridge on January the 11th. He was subsequently found guilty of her murder at Winchester Crown Court and was jailed for life, with a minimum term of 30 years to serve. Matthew Hamlin lodged an application for permission to appeal against his conviction, and his family launched a campaign to clear his name. They created a website, Matthew Hamlin is Innocent, which questions some of the evidence presented to the jury during the 6-week trial, citing the ease which the murderer gained entry to the victim's home and the fact that she apparently made no attempt to activate her alarm bracelet. They claim she was killed by someone she knew. But the pensioners' families say they have never doubted Hamlin's guilt. And following his conviction, Mrs. Edmund's son, Harry, praised Hampshire Constabulary's major incident team, describing it as world-class in its dogged pursuit of justice.